Welcome, everybody. Tonight we're working on Unit 11. Unit 11 covers the following topics that you see on the screen. Basically, we're looking at some advanced CSS topics. We're getting into that category now where we can start to play with features of CSS that give us some capabilities that are really, really fun and cool. They take a little bit of work to kind of learn how to use them, but some are very easy to use and really can create quite a visual and user experience impact on your website, depending on how you use them. I always caution people when you're making use of like cool technology, there's a fine line between it being like, oh wow, that's really cool, I really like it, and oh my god, that's really gaudy and not necessary and pretty useless. So you got to like really kind of know your audience when you're developing content, right? So like just be mindful of that. But as we learn some of the things that we're learning tonight, I think what you'll notice is when you go out and surf the web, how many websites are using these techniques to kind of spice up the user experience. And sometimes it's really, really subtle. And honestly, I think it's the subtle approach that usually works the best, in my opinion. All right. We are going to look at the different types of units that we use to control content with CSS. And we've talked about some of these already, but we're going to dig in a little bit deeper, kind of do some comparisons tonight, talk about what's useful, what's not, what's commonly used, what isn't. And then we're going to look at this concept of CSS variables, right? And without getting into like a whole lecture on programming, to give you this concept that we can do some kind of like really powerful stuff with CSS by virtue of like this function that we're going to look at. Also, we're going to look at transitions and animations. And these are, once again, features that have been added to CSS now some 15 to 20 years ago and allow us to do some pretty nifty things that we could not do in the past. And if you remember back to the very first time I took you guys to the CSS Zen Garden website where we looked at like the cool stuff that CSS could do. And, I mentioned to you at the time, there's no JavaScript or programming behind this. This is all done with CSS, right? And things are like moving and rotating and, reacting and so it really can create some really impactful stuff. So that's kind of we're going to like scratch the tip of the iceberg on that stuff to get your kind of mind open to it. I don't really require a lot of it in terms of coding it, but I do want to expose you to it so that, you have that basic fundamental knowledge to go forward from here. As you do dig into our other later web courses, like advanced web programming and JavaScript and beyond, we do a lot more of that type of stuff, because it is pretty normal in the web world. And once again, you don't have to memorize this stuff. The resources are out there to discover the content on your own. One thing I did not add to the top of the topic list here was all my reference links, which I'm going to write a note to myself to add those a little bit later. Maybe I'll do it during the break. For right now, we're going to dig into the lecture notes and just hit the topics one by one. We'll bounce out to W3 Schools as our reference. And we'll play with a lot of the try it tools out there, especially when we get to the animations and stuff, because they have really nice little examples set up and it's kind of good to kind of go with that. I am going to bring up all of my examples in my Brave browser here today. And so I'm going to kind of queue up the first one before I even get started. So I'm just going to copy this link and just have it ready to go inside of Brave. All right, so there it is. So this is the first topic we're going to hit, which is to talk about basically the different units. They call it different units for expressing length, and I think that's a little deceiving. I think of it as kind of like different ways to measure content for output. And this is really kind of interesting because when we kind of learn how to use CSS, like I usually start with pixels, because a pixel is a finite amount. So for example, like my screen, um, and I know I get kind of goofy with like the drawing and stuff, but if I go from this edge of the screen over to this edge of the screen from here to here, I have an HD screen. So this is 1920 pixels across, right? And then when I go from the top down to the bottom and really all the way to the bottom, right? On my screen, this is 1080 pixels tall. That's the standard, what we call HD resolution. If you have an ultra wide monitor or a 4K monitor, those resolutions will double or double, like a 4K would be double these dimensions in essence. Um, and the reference point really when we talk about HD is we usually look at the height. So this is 1080 pixels tall, and that's very hard to draw with a mouse, by the way. And then when we go to 4K, it's double that basically. And it kind of goes on from there, right? But knowing the resolution of your monitor is actually kind of an important thing, not to sound goofy about it, but I'm going to use my Windows key and the letter D just to go to my desktop here. I'm going to blow away the annotations. And then I'm going to use my mouse to just simply right click on an open spot on the desktop. So this is a Windows only demo, right? But if I go in here and I look at my one display, right, I can look at the scale of it and notice my display resolution is what I told you, 1920 by 1080. So it's width and then height. So this is really good to know, like when you're working HTML stuff, and you're trying to design something when you're looking at how many pixels it occupies, right? So if like my screen is 1920 across, if I go, halfway across the screen, well, it's half of that, so what would that be? Well, a little less than 1,000, right? Like 900 something, right? If I'm going the other way, right, and I can start to figure out how big things are. So if I make a box that's like this big, so I can tell you that's about 1,000 pixels wide because I know how big my screen is, right? So it is helpful to know these things. And as a designer, it's kind of a responsibility that the resolutions of the things that you're working with, and to really know the lingo of it too, right? Not like you have to become an expert with like display monitors or whatever, but I do think it's helpful to know those things. So they indicate here, right? It says many CSS properties take length values or size values, if you want to think of them like that, such as width, height, right? They don't mention it here, but like margin, padding, the font size, all of those you can declare with sizing elements. The ones that we probably use the most often in modern web design or you see on most websites are probably those two in combination with the percent sign, which is in essence an M, right? But we're going to talk about all the different ones and how they work. As they indicate here, there's two types of length units. Some are absolute, meaning they're actual precise measurements like pixels, for example. That's why it's good to know your screen size. And if you think about that in terms of like, for example, if you were to like be a carpenter or something like that, or you did some sort of trade work where you would use a tape measure and measure things, you would very specifically look at the size of something and you would measure it, right? Like, for example, I need this to be 12 inches long to fit this, thing that I'm building, right? And the size is really, really important that it's precise, right? And that would be like an example of an absolute unit, right? It's a fixed value. It is the size it is. Doesn't matter what size your screen is. If I make something 1,000 pixels wide and I put it on the screen that's, I don't know, 400 pixels wide, it's not going to fit. You see what I mean, right? So it's absolute. But then we also have the relative units, which in many ways are sort of preferred for modern design work because they are relative to something, right? Sometimes they're relative to other things that have an absolute value, right? So you might set the base font size at like I don't know, 18 pixels. And then you can say this font size is 150% bigger or 1.5 bigger than the base font size. So relative to a fixed amount. Or as we saw with the view width units that we used a session or two ago, that it can be relative to the viewport or what size the screen is currently. And that, and as I mentioned, that's kind of a technique that people are starting to push more towards in modern web design. I am trying to bring all my screens back here because your faces are hidden there, and I do want to like make sure that you guys are engaged here, I guess. Um, the absolute units fall into some, these categories here, and they do have try it tools for all of these, which I think is pretty fascinating. But with the absolute units, as it says here, they're fixed, right? And I use the example of like a tape measure and a piece of wood. And these are the ones that are on the screen here that will always be the size they are given the unit of measure. Now, here's kind of my take on this, right? And you'll notice that pixels is up at the top because that's really kind of the preeminent sizing methodology for a fixed absolute unit, right? 1 pixel in principle is 1/96th of 1 inch, meaning if I could like break my screen down by inches, like take out a tape measure and measure it, in principle, there's 96 pixels in an inch. That's what this is telling you. However, I can have a screen that has this resolution, like the screen next to me. This is a 17-inch screen in front of me. The one next to me is 27. They're both set for 1920 by 1080. So really, it doesn't really equate to an inch. On one screen, it might be an inch, and on the other one, it might be an inch and a half, right? So that's why, when we have these other measures where it's centimeters, millimeters, inches, points, and picas, all of these are comparable to actual physical measurements in the real world, but don't necessarily correlate to that exact size on the screen. So in order for it to be accurate on a screen, you need to have a reference. So in other words, if you have a screen that's actually where 96 pixels equals an inch, well, then you can use centimeters, millimeters, and inches, points, and picas and have it be exact. But if it's not, it's skewed, right? It's either bigger or smaller than what you think it is. So here's my take on this, right? And therefore, I take all these off the table when doing web work. That's kind of an interesting and kind of broad sweeping stroke because it'll vary. Like you might say inches or points or picas or any of that stuff, and it will not turn out to be what you think it is. So I generally would avoid all of those on a screen. Once again, if you know that your screen is accurate as a reference, then you can, right? But you can never guarantee, and I want you to think about this when you're delivering web content, what people are looking at it with. It could be a TV that's like 98 inches across, or it could be a tiny little phone screen. You know what I mean? You just don't know. So when you use absolute units, for me, pixels are always pixels, regardless of the resolution of your screen. Sometimes the pixels on one screen are bigger than another. Sometimes they're smaller, but a pixel is a pixel is a pixel, right? So that's kind of my take on this one. All right, so you take that for what it's worth, but I would generally avoid all those at the bottom of the list as a result. One example that we've done right from the beginning is setting font sizes with pixels, right? And this gives you very, very precise control of your fonts on a screen. It really does. And, frankly, this is still kind of my go-to. Like, if I want a font to be a certain size, I can go in there and declare it. I want you to notice like these tags that they've included here, H1, H2, and paragraph, on their own without declaring a font size. Your browser declares a font size for them automatically. And because they're built-in tags and have built-in styles in your browser, we call that user agent styling. So in other words, the browser the user is using has default CSS for default HTML elements. If you were to declare sizes for H1, H2, and paragraph, it's because you are not happy with what the browser is doing. Interestingly, the default font size and paragraphs are considered kind of like the default, thing. The default font size in a browser is 16 pixels. That's the baseline font size. Everything else is a scale off of that. But you can go in and declare that and change them all. And still a very popular approach for sizing a font. Of course, if you're squeezing it down to mobile and you want to squeeze more in, you can use, you could set a media query and say, hey, when the screen's really small, go from 40 pixels to 20 or something like that. So that's an approach you can totally use. And so these can sort of scale, but via media queries, right? And you can see media queries can kind of create a lot of extra code. So some people don't like to use them in the modern era. All right. Let's move on to the relative units. And I think that these are, probably where I think modern web designers should probably focus their attention more. And that is to use units of measure that automatically react either to some base level amount that you've already set. Like, for example, I might set for the body of my HTML. So I'd put in CSS, it says body, font size. And if I don't like the default of 16, I can override it and maybe say 18. And I actually do that pretty commonly. I like to make my fonts a little bigger. Like, why make people struggle to read something is kind of my thinking, right? Just make it a little bigger, and then we can use that as our base font size, and then everything else can be relative to it. So because I'm talking about that, I'm going to actually go ahead and demonstrate that technique right off the bat. I'll get Visual Studio Code up and running. I know I'm going to have Python stuff in here, so I'm going to want to close all that. I'm going to do a little bit of file management like I often do. So I save all my stuff on my Google Drive. You guys know my routine at this point. And then I have my C account, my fall 25 web folder. I'm going to make a new folder for unit 11. I don't have a unit 10 folder. I guess I never, I'm trying to remember why. Oh, I remember. Well, I had a failure last week, right? My Google Drive failed and I saved that somewhere else. Now, God help me. Where the heck did I put it? This is why I don't like to put stuff in places that I'm not used to. So this is actually a good teaching point too. And I do not like looking at my folders that way. And I'm going to sort by name. And oh gosh, I am not finding where I put that. So hopefully I put it in my documents folder. Okay, here's a different way I can find it. And you guys might run into the same problem. Maybe I can locate. Okay, so I put it in this really weirdly named folder because Google Drive was failing. So let me just go there. So yeah, you guys feel where I'm at with this, right? And that was on my desktop. And this is, folks, this is why file management is so important. So I took my unit 9, I brought it, I had it here locally. I made my unit 10, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my unit 10, I'm going to copy it from my local, and then I'm going to push it back up to Google Drive. That makes me feel a lot more comfortable to know it's in a cloud location where I can get to it later. So I'll just paste it in, right? And then, okay, I already made my unit 11 folder, right? So instead of copying the folder, I'm just going to go in here and copy all the stuff and then put it in my unit 11 folder. So I, in essence, have a copy now, right? So a different approach, but the same technique. All right, so now here in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to go ahead and open that folder, and I'm going to do it on my Google Drive. All right. And this is the folder we're working in. And there we go. So I'm going to close all the superfluous content here and kind of arrange my window. All right. I'm going to go ahead and this change I'm going to make is going to go into the style sheet. And I do want to show you that I already have kind of done this, right? Because this is kind of such a standard practice for me, is when I do set up a website, I do like to set the basic font size right here. And you can see I already have one set. Now, keeping in mind that the default font size, and we think of like a paragraph, right? Or if you create a div and don't give it a style, the browser will normally size that to 16 pixels. My preference is to go a couple pixels bigger, right? I declare that here. Now, for every other font declaration I make on my website, for example, I don't want to do it on the H1, but notice, let's take the nav, for example. This is a good example. I don't have a font size declared for my nav at all. None of the nav styling includes a font size. And so the font size for the nav is basically what I've declared up here in the body. Now think about this. When you look at your HTML, right, all of your HTML is enclosed in the body tag. So that affects all the fonts inside the body tag. You know, that's kind of the grand point. That includes the navigation. All right, let's do the live server thing. All right, and this is the current live view, and let's do the split screen approach here. All right, I'll collapse the sidebar and kind of readjust here a little bit. And you can see my font size right now as it is. And really, it's a fine font size, right? It's not bad. It's, you know, it's not horrible. But let's just say, I think, you know what? It's a little small. Let's just say that's my take on it. If I want to come down here, I can use an override. So I can just type in like a hard-coded pixel count. And instead of 18, I might take it up to 20 pixels. And then watch, I'm going to save. And notice how it just got bigger, right? This is hard coding. This is absolute, right? But I also might say, well, you know what? Well, let's do this. Instead of retyping it, I'm just going to save it. So it went back to what it was. But let's look at some of these other approaches, and I'm going to take these one at a time. The two that are basically the same, right, is the one at the very top of the list and the one at the very bottom of the list. But I want you to notice, right, there is a little bit of a difference. The percent is relative to the size of the parent element. It does not specify what it's attached to. You guys catching that? Right? Where this one is relative to the font size of the parent element. That sounds like kind of like what we want, but the net effect of these is essentially the same. It's all in the matter of how you're expressing it. So I'll give you an example. If I wanted to make that font 25% bigger than it is currently, I have two ways I could do it. I could say font size, and I could say 125%. So whatever it is right now, plus 25%. Saving it. There it is. Okay. Another approach is to use M's. So I could say 1.25 M. This is going to be the same effect. It should not change on the screen at all. It did not, right? It stayed the same size. Because basically 1.25 M is another way of saying 125%. So a lot of modern web designers, this is the approach they use, right? If I want to make something relatively larger, now you guys might look at that and go, oh yeah, that looks pretty good, right? Or you might look at it and go, that's a little too big, right? And I'm kind of waffling. Maybe it's a tad too big. So then I can just tweak this number a little bit and I can make it 1.2, which is 120%, right? So I can save that. And I don't know if you even noticed the difference, but it did get a smidge smaller. And this is how persnickety it gets, right? And I'm like, I don't know, 1.2 is maybe still a little too big. Maybe we'll go 1.15, you know? And then you start you start playing with it and it just changed again, and maybe you still didn't notice it. Yeah, it is very, this is like really, really minute adjustments is really what we're doing. All right, let's make the adjustment like super huge so you can see that it really does work. Like there you go. Okay, there's 215%. All right, yeah, that totally works. But these are the kind of little persnickety changes you'll make to your code. And why do you do that? Well, here's the why you do it. Because sometimes you're trying to fit stuff in, you're trying to hit a certain aesthetic, you want this thing to fit exactly there. And sometimes it really takes a little bit of kind of goofing around with it to get there. Now, let me give you another example of the effect of this. If I come up here to the body now and decide that my base font size, you know what? Let's go back to 16. I don't like, I don't, 18 is too big. And I save this. Notice that this also scaled down because it is relative to that size, right? So this is an example, right? This relative sizing is relative to the base font size here. So one correlates with the other. So if I change my base font size, the whole website changes. Let's make it a little more dramatic. Let's take it up to 24 pixels. Watch the menu, but also watch the text down here. Right, here's the save. And notice how everything kind of scaled. Yeah, very dramatic. But also notice that my header text, that didn't change at all, did it? Because that's declared probably with a specific font size. So I'm not affecting that one. That one's absolute. Right. And these are things that you guys will start to play with and wrestle with. But I want you to understand the mechanics of it, like how this one up here is going to steer the other ones that are relative percentages. So maybe we take this back down to 18. I was kind of comfortable with that. And it's kind of my personal go-to standard, but you guys come up with your own. Remember, the browser by default will do 16 as the baseline font. So if this is not here, it's 16. And when you do an M, it's relative to the 16. All right. So let's jump back over to Brave now. So we kind of, in essence here, have talked about M and percent. And then notice here that they have a new version called REM, right? And real frankly, I do not use this one a lot, but this is relative to the font size of the root HTML element. And I want to go into the Triad editor so you can see it, because basically, notice they're doing exactly what we did, right? So in this case, the body is the root element, and that's where the font size is declared, right? And then the rem basically forces this to operate relative to this. So why is there a rem and why is there an M? Here's the answer. If I have an element, let's say this, I put like 16 pixels on the body. The paragraph, the div, and the paragraph are all immediate children. They're all directly inside the body. And really, when you're coding, I like to tab stuff in so you can see like this stuff is inside the body, right? But let's say inside the div, I had a paragraph, right? And I did, let's say, and I don't want to get too convoluted with this example, but let's say I had a paragraph in here, right? And maybe I have another div in here. And then I set a fixed size for this div. And then I make these two inside of it an M. They're going to be relative to this div, right? But if I want them to be relative to the parent body, I use rem. That's the difference. So, you have to wrestle with these things. Which is the right one? Well, it depends. That's really the only answer. But I like this capability though, because think about this. If you use one base font size for the whole site, and then everything is a rem relative to it or an M relative to it, all I have to do is change one font size to scale up all the fonts for the whole website. Have you ever gone to a website where it's like they have a little icon where you can make the fonts bigger and smaller? When you click on those, basically what you're doing is you're changing all the M values in the CSS style sheet automatically all at once. That's how it's done, right? So I hope that kind of helps to explain it a little bit. There are some here, and I want you to be really mindful of this, that are marked as rarely used. So I'm not going to lecture on them, but you can explore it all you want. I'm going to put in that category the X, the CH, the FR. I'm going to say all of those are very, very rarely used. You can read up on them all you want, but it says this one's relative to the X height of the current font, rarely used. Very, very, very rarely used. This is relative to the width of 0. Okay, I don't even see the point of it, honestly. Yeah, it doesn't really make a lot of logical sense. And I'm sure there's a designer out there to explain why. Also, we have a fractional unit, which equals 1 part of the available space. This one I do see people starting to use a little bit more. So let's just take a really super quick look at it. So for example, where are we using this? The grid format is the 1 spot, right? And so, like, for example, if we do display grid, we have grid template columns, and we say 1 fractional unit, 2 fractional units, which implies 2 FR is twice as big as 1 FR. And then we have another one that's using a fixed value. So no matter how I change the screen, the 1 FR and 2 FR will always be 100% and 200% of each other, and 200 pixels always stays the same. So where would I use this? In this type of situation to control a grid. Makes sense, right? Because think about it, you couldn't make a website and you're like, man, I don't want that one column to change. The others can change, but I don't want that one column to change. So totally useful. All right. We saw what the rem does. Last week we played with, was it last week or the week before? We played with VW, right? Which is percentage of the viewport. Let's just look at it really quick again, just to kind of refresh. So here, the font size is 20% of the viewport. So in other words, it's occupying 20% of the screen, regardless of what size I make the screen. So it's infinitely scalable up and down. Really, actually kind of cool, right? So very useful, but it's relative to the width of the screen. If I look at its companion style, VH, this one's relative to the height of the screen. Okay, so to see that one, I have to do this, right? So the taller I make my screen, the more it scales. It has nothing to do with the width. So that might be appropriate too, right? I'll let you wrestle with when you want to use that. I tend not to use that one much. I do use the VW though, right? And I also own Volkswagen, so yeah, I use them in both capacities. There you go. Right. The other ones that are kind of interesting, and I am seeing these kind of creeping in a little bit more in web design, are the view min and the view max, right? So relative to 1% of the viewport's smaller dimension. Okay, this is really weird. Now think about what that means. So let's kind of apply it this way. If I use this one, right, it says resize the browser window both width and height to see how the font size of H1 changes. So let's do that. So first I'm going to do the width. And notice how like it scales when it gets small, but as it gets wider, it doesn't change. Okay, here's the why. Because I reach a point, this is about the point maybe here where it's a square roughly. And okay, watch the results of here, right? So when it becomes square, which is right around 539 by 539, I'm trying to get there, right there. Now both dimensions are equal. But if the width gets smaller, now it responds to the width. All right. Now, if we play with the height now, right, and all I can do is change the browser this way, now it's responding to the height, which is smaller, as opposed to the width, which is wider, right? So this is kind of a mind bender, but actually it's kind of a neat effect. It really is. I haven't found a lot of usage for it professionally, but I can see where it could apply, right? And my thinking is, right, phones is probably where it would apply the most, because think about like how many times you take your phone, and you go like this, right? Or you turn right, and a tablet might also respond to it. So play with those. Those are all relative ones. Heavily used, M, rem, percentage, VW, and then these other ones here are kind of starting to trickle in. FR is used for grid work. X and CH, not very commonly used. All right. Yeah. And notice the tip they give here, and the tip is spot on. M and REM are units perfect for creating scalable and responsive websites, right? You just have to know what you're relative to. They give an example here, setting the font sizes with M, right? Where you set your base font size in the body, right? And remember, if you're setting it to 16, you don't even need to add it, right? So because that's what the browser does automatically. And then all your other sizing is relative to it. This is a smart design approach. So if you have been going through and always, declaring fixed pixels, you might want to switch to M's and see what it does, and it might be better, right? And remember, the advantage of this is if I change this, all these others change automatically with it, right? That's kind of the power of it, right? Then we demonstrated the M, same difference, but it's relative to the root. Now notice here they're putting it on the HTML tag, which you can do. And a lot of people don't know that, yes, you can style the HTML tag also. I'm going to say it's kind of superfluous, right? Why would you do that? It's just a matter of which one you want to attach to, right? The body tag is there. I think of that as kind of the viewport element, but I see a lot of designers adding styles directly to HTML, right? So I think those are all really good examples of the sizing elements. And let's now kind of move on to the next thing, which is to talk about CSS variables. So I'm going to grab this link here and bring it back over to Brave. And let's take a look at this concept, because this is really kind of fascinating. Normally what I would do, like in a pretty large class size, I would ask this question: how many of you have had a programming class so far, right? And if you guys want to respond, but I think I kind of know the answer. Most of you are not doing programming yet, or if you are, maybe you're just doing Python. So this concept of what a variable is might be a new concept. But let me just explain it like this. A variable in computing or programming is where you take a memory spot in the computer and you give it a name, and then you place something in there for storage. And as long as your program is running, you can access that information, change that information, retrieve that information, and whatever. There's advantages to using variables in programming, because, for example, if I use one variable that has a value in it, let's say it's a variable that holds like sales tax rate or something like that. And then in my program, I have 20 spots where I'm calculating the sales tax. Kind of the same way we saw the base font size thing, variables kind of do the same thing. So I could just change one value in a variable, and if all my code refers to the variable, I've now changed all my code by changing one little snippet. Kind of the same way, like if I made a separate style sheet for every web page, man, that would be a lot of work to update. That's why we create one style sheet that affects every page. And think about the power of that, right? Currently, we have a handful of pages, but if I had 1,000 pages on my website and they all link to the style sheet, I can change one line of code here and affect all 1,000 pages at the same time, right? Super powerful. But we can also create what we call custom variables in CSS. And then the variables, and we haven't talked about the DOM yet because that kind of goes with JavaScript, but the DOM stands for the document object model, which is really like when we look at the inspect tool and we look at like the code and how this is broken down and all these little expanders, this is the DOM. Like every time you click on an element in here, this is one object inside the document in a hierarchy. That's what they're referring to. So don't feel mystified by that, right? So in other words, these variables can control different aspects of that hierarchy. And when you set one value in one spot, like we did with the font, right? This is the correlation here, right? I can like, I'm like, oh, hey, I want my background color for this, and that to all be green. But you know what? Now I'm a Vikings fan. I'm changing it to purple. Right. Sorry. I had to go there. Or I'm a Bears fan. It's blue and orange, that type of thing. So once again, so if you have like 20 elements on the page that are using the same color, you can declare it in one spot with a variable and then replicate it really, really easy. So for example, right, the general syntax is sort of like this, and whatever the root element happens to be, we would use a naming syntax. So we put the dash dash in front of it that indicates it's a variable, right? That's going to store a value. We give it a name. And really what we're doing is we're creating, think of it as a custom CSS property, right? That we're naming. It's not already available to us. And I want my background color to be green. Okay. Sounds good. Right. And then in other spots, on the page, right now we'll kind of get to it here's a better example, right? So I would have a root element, right, where I have my primary background color. That's the name I gave it, and I set a color value, and then a primary color, which would probably be for the font, right? And then whenever I want to apply that value, I use this syntax. So if I want the background color of my body to be this primary background color, I just say var and drop in the name. If I want my container to have that same background, or my H2 container to have the same background, all I have to do is use that syntax to apply it. And then once again, if I change my mind, then I'm like, that hex color, and I'm going to give you an example here, right? It FF is a little too strong in the blue position. I'm going to change that to, I don't know, AA, right? And I'm going to, so this change is then going to affect all of these spots where we say primary BG color. Watch the difference, right? Notice the background, the font, the stuff inside here, all change at the same time. One color change propagated out to a bunch of different things. All right. Where might you use that on your site? That I'm going to really leave up to you, because real frankly, when I, think about, what I should apply it to on my site, I'm not even sure, right? But I might do something to the effect of, if I'm declaring a font color, and you notice like the font color here, so this is kind of like a root font color. It's very dark, but it's not quite black. Right. And I don't know if you guys ever like pick up a book or a magazine and kind of study it. Some magazines will print like their text like straight up black. But on screens, really strong colors sometimes hurt your eyes, So toning it down just a little bit. Or like the thing about like when you paint your house, right? You don't buy like pure white for the walls, you get antique white, or off white. It's just a little bit dingy, so when you put fingerprints on it later, it doesn't look dirty, that type of thing. But it's also more comfortable for your eyes and reading. And so what I could do is I could take that color and I could set up just the way they're demonstrating here. I could set up a root. And in fact, I could use the same, nomenclature here, I guess, right? I can, well, you know what? I don't want to really use their colors or their names. So why don't I do this? I could add root. Let's put in our closing curly there, right? And then I could take this color, and that's, well, actually, I would take this part of the color. That's what I'll copy. But then I'd have to come up with like, maybe something, maybe their naming is good. Primary font color. And I'm a fan of naming it really what you're doing with it. And keep in mind, color in CSS refers to font color, makes no sense, right? Because that was the first thing you could color basically on a web page. But I'm going to name it primary font color. And maybe I do use that 333, whatever, that's just like a dark gray, right? And then here, instead of doing this, if I want to apply it to the body, and this is not really a good example because the body is kind of the root already. So maybe I just remove this from here. You know, why don't we do that? And then let's look at a spot here where like the H1, okay, that's straight. Notice this H1 is straight up black, right? Let's replace that. That's a good one to replace. So I could just do var dash dash primary font color. All right. And then of course I would want to see this in the browser. So I'd have to go back to my live browser view, wherever the heck that is. And wherever I have an H1, I don't know that I have any H1s on any of my pages. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to force an H1 in right here, right? I'm just going to drop in an H1 just for the sake of example. And I'm just going to say, go Packers, something like that. Let's save that. So now you can see that on the screen here. And I don't know if you guys are picking up on the fact that it's just a little bit gray, but let's change that root color a little bit. Let's make it a dramatically different color and save it. Now you can see how it changed that, right? So this is picking up this color. But you can see the advantage. Like if you're using a color over and over again, this is a really cool technique. Saves you a lot of time. All right. Maybe not super impactful if you're only using the color 2 or 3 times, whatever, right? But once again, I've written websites where I have like 10,000 lines of CSS. The ability for me to change one little color and have the whole site change, whoa, powerful, right? So I'm not gonna go with that color. Well, I mean, let's make it, you know, kind of black, but you know what? We could throw a little bit of color in there, you know, something like this. You know, I don't know that you'd even see that color, but let's just go with that, right? And then let's save it, and there you go. All right. So that's an example of using that particular style. I'm going to keep rolling on this, and we'll take a break fairly soon, but I'm hoping to hit maybe one more topic before we do. Actually, let's not. Let's take a break right now because as we go to this topic, this is a little bit deeper. Let's do a 5-minute break, and then we'll resume at like 5:46-ish, and then we'll continue on from here. So I'll see you guys in 5. Okay, we're back from break, and we're now going to move to part 3 here, which is talking about CSS transitions. So this is kind of an interesting thing, once again, that was added with, you know, the I think the release of version 3.3 of CSS, something like that. Don't quote me on the version number, but basically version 3 of CSS included this. It's been, you know, quite a number of years now since that was released. But it's really kind of a cool thing that has, I think, a lot of utility depending on how you use it. So what I'm going to caution you on is try not to over apply stuff like this just because it's kind of cool, because it has the capability of adding a good effect, but also at the same time creating a bad effect at the same time, either through overuse or if, like, for example, like what I'm going to show you is like you can take objects and make them bigger and smaller or change colors or whatever by very simple interactivity. And sometimes you make things bigger and smaller and it breaks your layout, right? So that's why you might not want to do it. But at the same time, very useful and very cool looking stuff. And essentially, we're going to be looking at these transition properties kind of one by one, and then we'll look at some examples here on W3 Schools and kind of roll with it. So if you look at this entry here at W3 Schools, it basically says it allows you to change property values smoothly over a given duration. Okay, here's an example of a change in CSS that's not smooth. I'm going to show you by looking at my own web page here. If you guys remember, I created these links for my navigation, and then in my CSS, and I'll pull up the CSS here somewhere here, right? So I created this basic style for my nav, and then for the links in my nav, I decided to get rid of the underlines and give those links a certain color, which is kind of a dark green kind of thing, right? And then I added in a pseudo class, right? That when I would hover over the link, it would change the color to whatever this is, which is purple. And let's make it a little brighter just so we can see it. So I'm going to save. So we'll go from Packer green to Viking purple, right? So I go here and you see it instantaneously changes from one to the other. All it takes is me moving my mouse over the text and the change is instant, right? But it doesn't have to be instantaneous. This is really kind of the point of a transition. So like to latch your head around. They have a little example here where it says mouse over the element below to see a CSS transition effect. Now watch what happens. Now you can see it's kind of grayed out, right? So your anticipation might be that if I hover over it, it'll become dark green like this. But notice even their buttons here have a hover effect. So I'm hovering and it goes from this green to a slightly darker green. But when I hover over this, watch what happens. It changes colors and it grows in size. And it's not like it's big, right? Like instantaneously, it's like, woo, like it's animated, right? And we can control the transition of it over a period of time and what's changing. And think about what's changing here. We're changing background color and we're changing size of the object at the same time just by hovering. And then as I hover and unhover, it's not, once again, instantaneous. There's a smoothness to it, right? And this is what we're learning how to do here. The transition property. So there's one property that's kind of combined, like we do with background, where like, or border, like where you can say 2 pixels solid green or something like that. Or you can say border style solid, border thickness 1 pixel, border color. You can separate them out. The transition property works the same way. So 2 of the properties are required no matter what. And the one is the property, like what are you transitioning? The background color, the size, what is it that you're changing? And the second thing is how long it takes for the transition to happen. You can also throw in a timing function and a delay. And you have a couple of examples here, right? So they have a little thing here that shows a div. It's already got a preset width, but you notice when you go to the very bottom of that style, they say the transition. So we're going to transition the width over 2 seconds. All right, this is what's going to happen, but we already have a width, right? So that's what your brain should be saying. So what are we transitioning it to? Well, here's how you trigger it. I would put in a hover effect on the div. So when I hover over the div, it would change from a width of 100 that we started with to a width of 300. And the transition is controlled from the parent element. Now I'm trying to see if like maybe I can just simulate this really quickly on one of my pages, but I have to kind of go in there and start looking at like probably one of my code pages right now. Yeah, maybe one of those ugly boxes could be a good victim for that. And then we have this also. All right, I'm kind of leaning towards maybe this page and trying to affect maybe one of these boxes. Maybe that's a nice low level effect that we can do. So I got to figure out like what element this is, and I forget, right? Because it's been a couple of weeks since I coded it. But you notice I did a right click right on top of the object. I chose inspect from the right click menu, or what they call the context sensitive menu. And it tells me that this is a div with an ID of box 3. So when I go to my CSS, I can come down here and look for box 3. And unfortunately, I found it pretty quickly. All right. Right now, the width is set to 100 pixels. And let's just copy the effect that they did, right? I mean, straight up from their site, let's do a transition of width over 2 seconds. So I'm going to add that to my box 3, right? But then I want to put in the event that's going to trigger it, basically. And so I'm going to say box W3 colon. Oh, yeah, I didn't want it down there. I guess my thumb landed on the touchpad there. I want it up here, curly brackets, and then we'll change the width and let's make it a little dramatic. Let's make it 200 pixels. I have no idea what this is going to do to my layout, by the way, right? I haven't vetted this, I didn't like pre-plan it. It might be all right, it might be whatever, but the point is just to try it. All right, so here is the saving. And let's go back to the browser now. And in principle, this is already reloaded. So box 3, oh, you notice what happened though? It jumped, right? Okay, and notice it takes 2 seconds for it to grow in size. All right, kind of cheesy, but also kind of cool at the same time, right? So like, I'll let you guys decide, is this an effect you want or is this an effect you don't want? I could think of some cool ways to use this for sure, right? Um, and this is just transitioning one property. I could also transition multiple properties and apply other types of effects to it. So let's go back to W3 here and kind of look at some of their other examples. If I wanted to change multiple values, here's an example. I want to transition the width over 2 seconds, the height over 4 seconds, and the background color over 3 seconds. All right. I don't know if I want to change height, but maybe background color would be a good one to change, right? Because it has a background color. And so, like currently I have this background color. So I could add it down here. Let's pick a different color, right? Something a little different. Fine, we'll go with that. And then if you look at their syntax here, I just comma separated, right, with the seconds. So I'm just going to say comma, and what are we affecting? Background color. And let's make that, I don't know, let's make it a really long time frame. Like 4 seconds is pretty long. Right? Let's save it. Back to the live view of the page. Here comes the hover. Ooh, pretty snarky, cool. I don't know. I'll let you judge, right? And I'm not saying this looks good, but I'm just showing you how it's done. And it gives you a little bit of wow, right? And now if you start thinking about the fact that I can make this effect just about any CSS property. Okay, now you start like thinking in your head, oh, I know what I'm going to do, right? And I could do like other really weird things. For example, I could set and you know what? I don't want to go too deep in on this, but I could just like do something. I don't know. Let's say just make the padding larger, like at 100. No, that's a lot. Let's make it 40 pixels of padding, and then we'll add that to the list. And let's make that take 10 seconds, right? That's a really super long time. All right, saving. All right, let's go back and take a look. So it's going to change width, background color, and padding. Ooh. Now, isn't that really kind of an interesting effect? Because look how long it takes for the padding to go back. That's what I'm saying. That's a really long time frame. So maybe that's kind of weird. So let's make that, I don't know. Let's make that also 4 seconds. But what's kind of neat about that is because I up here, why the box isn't getting bigger, by the way, we're doing the box sizing border box thing. So the box doesn't change when I put padding on it. So once again, I should probably keep the style up on the screen for reference, right? These are the styles. Here we go. Pretty groovy, right? And I'm not even trying very hard, So be creative, folks. Come up with some sort of thing that might, trip your trigger and, give you something. I don't know, like if you're feeling the magic here, go for it. Right. A couple things to talk about though, as we kind of do this more and more, you'll notice that there are different ways to transition. And this is really kind of weird because this kind of really lends into like the animation field. So, like, if you were an animator that, let's say worked with animation content, these are things that you talk about a lot, like how you transition. It isn't always necessarily like the smooth straight line thing. There is basically this transition timing function where you have a bunch of different approaches. The default one that we've been working with is what they call ease. So it like easily and smoothly makes a transition. There's also ease in, ease out, so you can control different approaches going in and out of the effect. And then you can also kind of customize it pretty deeply. What they've put together here is an example of some of the key ones. And I just want to show you this because I think it helps to really explain how they work. So here's linear, ease. Notice the difference, right? This is a very consistent rate. This moves quick and then slows down. Ease in, starts slow and finishes fast. Ease out, starts fast, finishes slow, right? And then there's ease in and out. So it's like slow, fast, slow. Okay. Like you might see a reason to tweak that. I like the default one, works pretty well. I mean, so like I'll leave it on you to play with those once again, but I just want to put them on your radar as a thing. Another thing you can throw into the mix is what we call the transition delay. So the transition will still happen here over 3 seconds, but it will wait a second and then do it. That's what the delay is. So watch 1001, and now it starts. I move off 1001, and then it finishes. So take it for what it's worth. All right. So those are the transition effects that are part of our lecture. I demonstrated it in one spot, and you know what? You should try that too. It's not really very hard to do. And you can completely mimic my techniques if that's the approach you want to take. All right, let's move on now to this um, you know transition thing. We're basically looking at the same effect here, but um, I want you to think about a couple of things that are different about this, right? So this is basically the button example that we were looking at before. So what I guess the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a button to mess with, and then we'll mess with it. All right, so let's jump back here to W3. And by the way, we're going to talk about transform next week. I should probably give you this as well. Here's a button example right here, but this kind of covers two topics here. So the one topic is when you do these transitions, you can use a combined syntax, right? So this one I'm putting in the fact that I'm changing the background color over 1 second, I'm easing out, and then I'm transforming for 1 second again to ease out. So it's like kind of covering like two things at the same time. Watch what happens to that button and notice the effect of growth and how the transition looks. And really kind of the whole point of like easing in and out is to make it feel as natural as possible. Right. That's the whole kind of point of it. All right, let me go back and take a look at a couple of things here that they have as examples, right? Right. So that I think we've seen that one. That's got all of the properties set separately, right? And I apologize. I'm kind of fumbling here with my with my screens, but maybe we work on this, and what we can do is look at a couple of these different ones, and you can copy these and apply them on your own. Really, um, the styles that we have here are basically ones that you could put on any element. And I'm really kind of tempted to borrow this one, and maybe I'll just zoom in on it a little bit because this one, I already have like a box 3, right? Um, and this one affects opacity. So, like, in other words, opacity is a style, and I don't know that we've used that one a lot in our code. So, going back to my code sample page here, if I can just find it. Oh gosh, I guess it's here. Yeah, right there. And we've been messing with this box, right? Now let's mess with this one, right? This is, I assume that's box 2, but if I'm not sure, yep, that's box 2, right? So for box 2, we can preset here an opacity, which is how transparent something is. So if I set this to 1.0, it'll just be what it is. It's not transparent at all. It's 100% visible, right? But if I set opacity to something like 0.3, it's only 30% visible. Let's just save that and take a look here in the browser and notice how it dimmed out a little bit. Yeah, right. That's the opacity. So with this one, I can do the similar effect here, and I'm going to borrow from my lecture note code if I can find it. We're going to do this transition, which is opacity 0.5 seconds, so half a second, ease out, and then we'll set it to 1. So opacity 0.5 ease out, right? And that is, oh shoot, and I hate when it does that, but that's because I'm in edit mode and I should get smart and get out of edit mode, basically. But now that I'm in edit mode, I'm just going to kind of leave it there. All right, let's just grab that and we'll just borrow it verbatim. Right, and you can borrow this code verbatim as well, right? You don't have to create your own code if you're not sure, but you can still try the techniques. And then we'll borrow that code to do the result of it. And of course, I have to tweak this because this should be box 2 and it's an ID. And then we'll set the opacity to 1. Okay. So let's save it. Back to the browser, hover. So kind of a pretty silly but cool effect. I could see use for this one for sure, right? Might look good on a menu or something like that. Or maybe you have like, if you're doing a Green Bay Packer page, maybe you have like a helmet and it's like 75% opaque and then you hover and it becomes completely visible. That might be kind of cool. Another thing that we could do here, and just for the sake of example, we are on my code test page, which is this one. So let's open that file here. Let's find those boxes. And I think maybe below these boxes and above this thing here, so we'll go below box 3 and above that paragraph. We'll create a button. So I'm just going to drop in a button here. And I'll just call it whatever. So let's just take a look at the button first. There it is. Very exciting indeed, right? And we can style the heck out of this, right? And I don't want to apply this to all buttons, by the way, so I'll probably just give it a class and call it, whatever BTN, right? It's the whatever button, right? That's my syntax there. So I'm going to copy that class name. Let's go ahead and save this code. And then I'm going to go back to my style sheet and I'm going to kind of keep it in the same area where these other styles are. So we'll put it here. This is a class, so I'll start with a period, put in some curlies, and let's now apply the special effects that are recommended in these lecture notes here. Right, so we're just going to borrow these button effects. Right, so we're going to borrow all those styles. So you can see there's the background color, the font color, the padding, the border. So there's no border on the button. And you can do more styles to it. Obviously, you could round the corners or do whatever the heck you want. Let's take a look at what it looks like now that I saved it. So you see how the button got a little bigger, right? It seems to me like this could really use a margin top or something like that to give it some space above. So I'm just going to do that. I could also put in some carriage returns, I suppose. But let's just take a look and see what it did. Okay, we moved it away from the other objects. All right, now let's go back and grab the other transition stuff, right? And of course, we're going to have to tweak the style a little bit to match our naming, right? So it's not going to be button, it's going to be whatever button hover, right? And notice we're just shifting greens ever so slightly. I'm going to make the effect a little bit more dramatic. And this is going to scale up by 10%. I'm going to make it 20%. But once again, I want it to be a little bit more dramatic. All right, back to the live view. This should already be refreshed, and there you go. Now, that transition, mind you, happens over the course of 0.3 seconds. That's a third of a second. That's really, really fast. So maybe if I bump that up to 0.6, we'll see it a little bit more smoothly. Let's see. There you go. Not too bad. So I do, want you guys to play with this stuff and then find creative ways to add it to your site. Um, some words of caution, though, right? One spot where I would often tell people don't do those, like, don't hover, make your menu so that your menu gets bigger. Because if like you were struggling just to get it to sit right, and then all of a sudden you're changing the size of one of the things, it could just break the whole layout. Good, bad, I'm not sure. Okay, here's a spot where it might be kind of cool. Like right now, I got a Green Bay Packer logo here. Maybe if I hover over this, making that bigger would be kind of cool. Or maybe making it a little, transparent and then making it darker. That might be kind of neat too. So let's find a little practical task like that to try, just for practice on some of these transitions. All right, so I can use any one of my pages has that logo on it. So let's just get into the code here just a little bit. So I'll just do it here on the index page since it just happens to be there. And here is the image, and I did give it an ID. So I'm looking in my CSS for Packer headline. So let's go find that in the CSS, and it's probably here. Or is that the right code? Okay, now I'm questioning myself. No, that's right. That's the image, right? Packer. Oh, I see. So it's not okay. So I got to make sure I'm looking at this image, not that one. I want the one in the header. Okay, my bad. Here we go. All right, here's the image. That one's called header logo. That makes a whole lot more sense. No wonder I couldn't find it. So here it is, right? And notice, oh, right, I played with the width on this one and we set it to a maxed width. This is so it responds correctly. You guys remember that? All right, let me see if I can still mess with the width a little bit. But one thing I could certainly mess with would certainly be the opacity. And I think that might be a really kind of fun one to try. So maybe I set it initially, I'm going to try about, I'm going to guess, I'm going to do like 65%. And I'm going to save it and let's take a look. Okay, this is 65%. Okay, not too bad. Not great, but not too bad, right? Once again, following the techniques that we've been doing, which is we've been mostly focusing on the hover effect, which is a pretty common one for a website. Now we can change that opacity to 100%. Saving it. Okay, maybe that's a little dramatic. You guys feeling that? Right. So maybe 65 is too much. Maybe 80% is good. All right, let's see that. Okay, not bad. But now let's make it a smoother transition. So this is where we can borrow some of our other code. And I'm going way back down here again. And um, the real simple post is just say transition opacity, the number of seconds. So let's try that. Okay, back on up. And I don't know what you want to do. A second, second and a half, one, how about 1.5 seconds? And I mean, I could do like an ease out. Let's do an ease in out. How about that? Just to try it. Saving, checking. I'm not sure if you guys are even seeing the change in opacity because I think this value is now too high. Let's go to 0.7. Not too bad. I think the rate of change is a little slow. So I'm going to do like 0.8 seconds. Watch it. Right. So pretty subtle. Right. So, these are really kind of, you know, persnickety kind of little tweaks that you make to a page, right? To try to figure out like, what looks good and what doesn't. Um, I do like the transition effects quite a bit in terms of like what we can do with them, um, and how it can make our site feel a little bit richer, without like really messing up the content too much, right? And it gives the feel of interactivity. And see, now I look at it and go, that's a little too dark, right? And the transition's a little too slow, and this is what you'll do, right? Well, that's not quite right. I'm gonna try 0.75 and zero point 0.6 seconds, and then you like sit there all day and just play with these numbers, right? That's all right, right? That works, it's okay. All right, so I did want to throw in one additional lecture topic here, and I didn't think I would have time for it tonight, but apparently I have plenty of time for it. And so I'm going to add a little lecture note bonus piece on this one. And this is the concept of what we call a tooltip, right? And this is something you do see on websites quite a bit. And basically what a tooltip is like you hover over something and you're not necessarily transitioning it, but it gives you more information about the thing you're hovering over, right? So let me actually do this first because I think this is kind of an interesting effect um, with images. And before I do the full-on tooltip thing, and we'll just focus on this image right here, right? And you'll notice right now, if I find that image in my HTML code, and that's this headline image right here. And so let's go full screen on that for just a second. But if you guys remember, right? So I have my image. I gave it an ID so I could style it. I have my source, like where it's located in my folder structure. And then I have the alt tag. And of course, the alt tag exists for the purpose of if the file's not there, this is the text that shows up in place of the image, right? That's what that's for. There's another attribute that we can add here. And this is kind of like a tooltip. It's called the title tag, right? So I'm doing this kind of like for a reason, right? So the title tag allows me to put in text that would appear when I hover over the image without creating a tooltip. So I'm just going to say Packers headline. Well, let's just leave it at that, right? And I'm going to save it. Let's go back to the website now and watch what happens when I hover. I get that little pop-up box. All right. Not super fancy, but you know what? Kind of cool, right? Really super easy to add. So adding a title attribute gives you a little pop-up. That attribute is designed for images. And if my memory serves me correctly, I think you can add it to just about anything and it still works. And we could test it if you want, but it really is designed for images. Okay, so that might be a good one. Okay, but a tooltip is a little bit different because this is something we're gonna code, right? So notice like how that works, and notice what they're pointing out here is you can put it above, to the right, below, or to the left. You can choose, right? So I think that's really kind of a neat little effect. They have an example here of some code. And what I would suggest to you is that, rather than try to code it yourself, right, that you kind of study this a little bit and see how they're doing it. So let's just take the time since we have it to talk about this. We'll spend about 5 minutes on it and then we'll just kind of move uh, forward. Now, what I think is really particularly interesting about this is you can take some plain old HTML elements here. And I want you to notice that when we look at the screen over here, right, I see the H2, that's this, right? I see the paragraph, that's this. And then I see this, which is, notice, a div. And then inside the div is a span tag that I'm not seeing right now. You guys catching that? So that span tag that's got a class of tooltip text, when I find its style, notice visibility is set to hidden. That's kind of the same as saying display none, by the way, right? However, it does have all of its other styles. So like if I get rid of this, so I'm just going to cut that out for a second and run it. That's where it sits. And I can tweak it. I can change its size. I can, pick all the different, settings I want for it. And notice they even have a border radius. The text is centered. It's a certain color. I can tweak all of that stuff. I can control every little bit of it, right? But when I add this back in and run it, it goes away. And then what we do is we set up a hover effect on the tooltip, right? What's the tooltip? The tooltip is the whole div. So the whole div that contains that. So when we hover, it affects the tooltip text, this piece, and just simply switches the visibility to visible. Very, very, really very, very simple to do in this case. Now, in order to position it, we have a separate style, right? And notice what the style is going to apply to, right? Just tooltip, which is the name of the whole div, and how we're positioning it. And I think this is really fascinating. So this is a really simple little technique. It does require a bit of code to make it happen. But if you want to try this, and maybe I'll make this like an extra credit piece or something like that. And I'm going to think about that for a little bit. But these are techniques that you can so simply apply without really knowing a lot of coding techniques. If you go back to their concept here, and start, adjusting this, how do you get it to go left? How do you get it to go right? They give you the code for it, right? So like if you want to try a right aligned tooltip, right, or a left aligned tooltip, they show you the code, right? Top and bottom aligned, all the code is there for the taking, right? So what I would suggest is read up on it, check it out. If you find a place where you might want to add that, you can borrow the code and try to make it work. I do, I have this recollection of like one of the first websites I actually did for real for somebody, there was no pay involved. I did it on a volunteer basis because it was a nonprofit, but it led to me working in this field and teaching today, I guess, is I built a website that had exactly this effect. And what I did is when you would hover over an image, like a little gallery image, it would show you the big one, and I was doing this about 20 years ago. And when I put that effect on the web page, man, the people just loved it to pieces. They were like, "Oh my God, that is so cool. How did you do that?" I'm like, little CSS magic, you know. And really, truly, I didn't know how to do it. I found an example online of somebody else doing it, and I backwards engineered their code and just stole it, you know, and then I used it on my website. But that's what web people do, you know. Keep in mind that whenever you're on a web page and you can like right click, view source, or inspect, I mean, oh my God, you can look at all what is driving the code. They can't hide it from you because it's in the browser, and the browser allows you to do the backwards engineering, right? And I think that's wonderful, right? All right, let's can the lecture here. I think that's more than enough material for 1 week. So this video ends here.